We'd like to give you a few tips on how we load the Lot-o-Tumbler barrel. Getting the right amount of water and the right amount of grit in there is really important to having it work properly. Here's your first tip. What we usually start out with is a 3-pound tumbler barrel with a few rocks in the bottom. That makes a great stand for resting the Lot-o barrel on. Then we're going to remove the lid and we're going to get the material that we're going to tumble, and we're going to just load it into the barrel. And we'll continue loading it until we have filled it up to approximately this level where the barrel changes curvature and starts to become narrow. Okay, we've loaded the barrel up to a little bit higher than where the curvature changes, and what we're going to do now is add water. We're going to just about fill the barrel with water. Okay, there it's full. Now we're going to dump it out. Okay, we have the barrel filled with water. What we're going to do next is invert the barrel and let the water drain out between our fingers, something like this. We want to drain all of the water out. We don't want to run rock soup. Instead, we want the rocks to be dripping wet. So take a little bit of patience while this drains out. When it stops dripping, that's the amount of water we want to run in the barrel. We want wet rocks. We don't want standing water in the bottom of the barrel. Okay, we have about 4 pounds of wet material in the Lot-o-Tumbler barrel. Normally, for 4 pounds of material in a rotary tumbler, we would use about 8 ounces of grit. But the Lot-o-Tumbler uses very little grit. So we're only going to add about 2 tablespoons of grit. That's all. And so we can close the tumbler back up. We can put it on the machine. One more tip. It's okay to take the lid off to look into the machine to see how it's doing. But you should never run it with the lid off, because that'll evaporate some of the water in the barrel. There's only a tiny amount in there. We want to be sure that it stays there. Here's our Lot-o-Tumbler in action. Notice it's on top of a concrete block, and the holes in the block have been filled with concrete. We have it glued to that concrete block to hold it in place. It's always supposed to be run attached to a stationary object. So we use a concrete block. That block is also on a piece of styrofoam because we found that that seems to reduce the noise, at least for us. Let's take a look inside and see what's happening. This is the proper action of the material in the barrel. Notice how it's rolling. If we grab a piece out, you can see that it's covered with a thin layer of grit. That's what we want. We want each piece to be covered with a thin layer of grit so that as they vibrate in the barrel, they're removing material from one another. If there was too much water in the barrel, the grit would not stick to the rock. It would just wash off. If there wasn't enough water in the barrel, the pieces of material would be sticking together. You can solve that by adding about 1/2 capful of water. Always run the machine with the lid on, because if you don't, the small amount of water in there will evaporate. This tumbler's been running for about 24 hours. Let's take a look and see how it's doing. Notice how the action has slowed down significantly, and the particles are covered with a thick layer of mud. That mud is a product of the grit breaking down and the material breaking down. This is time to rinse the rock and add more grit, or if you're finished with this stage, it's time to clean up and move to the next step. One thing that I do to clean up more easily is to add a few shots of liquid soap and about 1/2 capful of water. Run that for 5 or so minutes, and that'll really help clean the grit and mud off the rocks a lot easier. Okay, let's open it up. You can see that that soap foam has really broken up the mud, and that's going to make it a lot easier to rinse these rocks.